Okay, the final section then we're going to look at is the 30-15 intermittent fitness test, which is a really useful test and is often regarded as the gold standard for aerobic fitness testing in team sports. So we're going to dive into it and look at the reasons why it helps to increase the accuracy of prescription, why it can be useful for team sports, and why it's relevant to hockey overall. So as a recap, really, because we obviously covered this in the assessment section, it is an intermittent shuttle-based test. So because it's intermittent, because it's shuttle-based, it makes it a little bit more specific to the demands of hockey. Athletes run for 30 seconds, starting at 8 kilometers per hour, and then rest for 15 seconds before walking to the next line. And this is on an audio track, so it tells you exactly what to do at each level. Every level then increases by half a kilometer per hour, and the final level completed is the athlete's VIFT score. So as a recap, in terms of the definitions we looked at in the first video in this section, VIFT stands for Velocity in the Intermittent Fitness Test. So if you complete level 20, but you can't complete level 20.5, your final score is 20 kilometers per hour, which you use directly for prescription. So that VIFT score there of 20 would be used to prescribe for 3-minute intervals, 30-second intervals, and so on. So as a recap, this is a really useful test to complete. In terms of more detail, though, just make sure you go back to the assessment section where obviously I dive into this in a lot more detail. But that was just a bit of an overview and a recap just to remind you how you actually do the test. So have a look back in that section if you've got any more kind of questions on that one. As a reminder again, it isn't maximum aerobic speed. We've looked at maximum aerobic speed already, which is the lowest speed at which VO2 max occurs. Your VIFT score is a composite score of a number of different physiological variables. So this is both a positive and a somewhat negative thing depending on how you look at it and your resource to complete testing. So just to recap, it's not the same thing, it's slightly different, it has similarities, but it's a score and a prescription and an assessment in its own right. So my general advice would be either try to prescribe off of maximum aerobic speed and one step better anaerobic speed reserve, or directly from the 30-15 test. And by the end of this video, hopefully you'll know which is more applicable to your individual context. So as a recap again, it's a composite velocity, so it takes into account anaerobic capabilities and change direction ability, all of which contribute to field-based team sport performance. So all of those things are really positive because, we don't just want to be good at running in a straight line. We want to be able to complete high-intensity actions anaerobically, change direction effectively, and all of these things help to contribute to effective team sport performance. It's also related, importantly, to repeat sprint ability. So Martin Bichet, in his research into this test, found that it is directly related to repeat sprint ability. So in other words, athletes who perform better in a 30-15 test also perform better in repeat sprint ability testing too. And because it's such a key physical quality in team sport and it's so important in hockey, you could argue that the value of the test is that it provides an insight into a number of variables: aerobic capacity, anaerobic capabilities, change direction, repeat sprint ability. And so it's like a hybrid, or as Martin Bichet refers to it, a composite value of a number of different physiological qualities. So it is a very useful test because it provides insights into lots of different areas. It provides consistent results as well, so it's a reliable measure of aerobic capacity. The research has shown that. And it means that we can trust the results, that they'll be replicated in the future, and we can prescribe from the data directly, which is very, very helpful. So rather than having to do any other calculations to kind of convert the score into something else, you can just use the score straight away, just like you can use mass score. But obviously this, because it's more helpful in terms of generating insights into things like anaerobic capacity as well, as we'll see, the physiological responses to a prescription is a lot more accurate. In terms of individual responses then, if you just first of all look at the two graphs here, this is again some of Martin Bichet's work into the 30-15 test. The top graph shows heart rate responses to interval sessions at 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, based on a different test, which I won't go into, but needless to say, it doesn't account for anaerobic speed reserve, which the 3015 does. You can see the the huge sort of variation here, 10%, what's called coefficient of variation between the physiological responses of the athletes to the same session. With 3015, however, you can see that because it's much more kind of accurately prescribed, it's more physiologically equitable. Again, it's consistent in that sense. It's only a 3% coefficient of variation between athletes' heart rate responses because, again, it's related to anaerobic as well as aerobic qualities. And when you're doing high intensity interval work, one of the most important factors is that you do incorporate and do account for that specifically. So you can see there's a huge range here, very tightly matched here. So again, this is about optimizing for physiology. We're trying to make sure that the prescription we're giving to athletes is as specific so that we can get the right adaptations in the body as possible. Pros and cons then in terms of this testing. In terms of the pros, it's more consistent physiological response. As we said, there's less coefficient of variation because you get a more kind of neatly matched response overall in terms of heart rate responses. You can prescribe directly from it, and it's related to repeat sprint ability, which is one of the most important physical qualities for hockey players. Cons, though, it's difficult to administer with large groups. It doesn't provide mass or maximal sprint speed scores because it's this hybrid and it sits in the middle of anaerobic speed, in the middle of maximal sprint speed and maximal aerobic speed. It sits within the zone of anaerobic speed reserve, but doesn't provide either of those other two factors. And levels are large from a motivational perspective. So in order to get from level 19.5 to level 20, you have to do up to 30 seconds more work before you can achieve it and complete that level. Whereas if we take something like a 30-15 compared to a 16 pitch lengths, in a 16 pitch lengths to make a meaningful kind of step forward, you can just take a few seconds off. Whereas with the 30-15, you're having to jump up a whole level, which does provide challenges in terms of the psychology of the test. If players know that they're going to have to work for 30 seconds more just to go up a level, sometimes that can be a hard barrier to overcome. One thing which I've included in this section is a paper that we kind of as a Hockey Wales team submitted a number of years ago, which is about looking at how you could use the steps within a level to use that as a measurement. So, for example, rather than just 20 or 20.5, it would be 20, 0.3 to account for 3 shuttles within that level, so that players would have smaller targets to aim for. And so it just makes it a little bit more incremental rather than these huge steps forward. So do check that one out as well. Calculating running distances from it. So step 1, you have to convert the kilometers per hour to meters per second just to make things simpler and cleaner. So kilometers divided by 3.61 gives you meters. So for example, 20 divided by 3.61 gives you 5.54. So as you can see, a good score for a female athlete in hockey, for example, of 20 is actually 5.54 meters per second. So it's actually a lot higher than maximum aerobic speed. And again, the reason for that is that it's an intermittent fitness test, not continuous. So the final speed that an athlete achieves is actually significantly into their anaerobic speed reserve and not at the velocity of VO2 max. Step 2, then you take the score, multiply it by the running intensity you want, and then multiply by the interval duration again to give you your prescribed distance. So 5.54 times by 90% times by 10 seconds gives you a 50 meter target. Now, one thing you'll notice with this is that even for 10 seconds, we're not going to be running at 100% or above of our VIFT score because of the sheer intensity at which you're working at that point. And very simply, if you're working at 100% of VIFT, you're near enough sprinting, and therefore you may as well just perform maximal sprinting and do true speed work rather than try to use it as a conditioning assessment or a conditioning session instead. So I hope that makes sense. So the intensity is so high that you can't go above 100% in terms of the conditioning intervals. It's generally going to be sitting around 90% in a sort of 10-second prescription, which equates to around 120, 130% of mass. Example conditioning sessions then, short intervals, we've got 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off for the long intervals. In the 10 on, 10 off session, we've got a running speed of 90% of VIFT, And we're going to do something like 2 sets of 10 to 15 reps with 6 minutes recovery per set because the intensity is so high. And there's a 50-meter target if the athlete's VIFT is 20. Long intervals then, you can also prescribe directly from, which is helpful. 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off at 80% of VIFT. Going to hit around 5 to 6 sets in total, and a distance target of 798 meters in distance if the athlete's VIFT score was 20. So 2 examples there of sessions you can do directly taken from 3015 score. Again, if you're then going to prescribe for multiple athletes, we're going to take that 3-minute session at 80% of VIFT. We're going to take VIFT divided by 3.61, multiply by 80% and times by 180 seconds for the 3 minutes. Again, we will be able to prescribe accurately based off of that as well. So we've got another means then of prescribing for athletes across a range of different capabilities. So we've got a 20, a 19.5, 19, 20.5 and 18.5. They would all have different prescriptions based on that. And then similarly, if we're going to do 10 seconds, clearly if the distance is small or the interval duration is short, then the difference between athletes for a given kind of interval is going to be relatively small. So it's still relatively big, but in terms of absolute numbers, it might appear small, a metre or 2. But that does obviously add up if we're going to be doing something along the lines of 25 to 30 repetitions of that. So again, similarly, maths-wise, you do VIFT divided by 3.61, times by the percentage, and then times by the duration you want to work for. And then again, this sort of set of athletes would have a range of different distances to aim for, and we can use that and prescribe directly from it again, which is helpful. So a couple of references there for the 3015. So in summary, the 3015 is a lot more specific in terms of its what it's assessing. It's a composite value that accounts for more than just maximum aerobic speed, but also for things such as anaerobic speed reserve, change direction ability, and it's related to repeat sprint ability as well, which is obviously super important. It's more difficult to administer with large numbers, so it can be a little tricky in terms of logistically trying to get everyone to do it. But if you can use it, then it's a really helpful tool to overall prescribe for athletes and make sure that the physiological demand placed on athletes is relatively the same, so you don't get huge variations in physiological response, as opposed to using a mass score only, where you're probably going to get quite a significant range of physiological responses to that. So ultimately it boils down to simplicity versus optimization. You know, depending on your context, you'll understand which of the two approaches is better, whether you just want to use mass, whether you want to use mass plus the flying 10 meter speed to determine anaerobic speed reserve, or whether you want to go all in and use a 30-15 score, which is going to enable you to prescribe directly from that as well.